We've had 4 rounds of the FIDE Grand Swiss tournament taking place on the Isle of Man. It's a fascinating event. Of course, the top 2 will go into the candidates tournament. So it's a really strong lineup going for those big 2 prizes. But I'm going to take you back to a game played in round 3. And this is the shortest win played so far in the tournament. It lasts just 18 moves, but there's a lot going on in this 18 move game, and it's also a very practical system. So Matthias Bluebaum playing white. He's one of Germany's top players, number 2 behind Vincent Keimer. And there's Vahap Sanal playing black. He's from Turkey. So it's a reti so far. This can of course transpose into a normal queen's pawn opening with d4, or you can play a standard reti system with g3 and bishop g2. e3 from Bluebaum. So he's inviting his opponent to play c5, and that's like a standard queen's pawn opening with colours reversed. So it's interesting. Bluebaum just hanging back for the time being. Knight f6 and c4. So that challenges black in the centre, and Sanal just supports the pawn in the middle. So it's all about keeping the centre. Knight c3, standard development, and now commonly this goes into what's called a semi-tarash. So if black claims the centre with c5, then white can either play d4 or you can take and go d4. I mean, this system that Bluebaum is playing is not an attempt to blow your opponent off the board straight away. It's more about just getting a pretty normal position and then trying to outplay them positionally. But anyway, bishop e7. But this is more interesting because yes, white can still play d4, but Bluebaum plays b3, putting the bishop on the long diagonal and just delaying planting that pawn in the middle of the board. And this can give rise to some very interesting ideas, sometimes featuring g4 and g5. We've seen that in quite a few games over the last few years. Castles, bishop b2. So for example, if black were to play c5 here, then you can take, and if knight takes, then you can either play queen c2 or even queen b1, looking to get some kind of attack on the king side, and perhaps later advancing these, perhaps the h-pawn, perhaps the g-pawn sometimes. It's very interesting. But Sanal plays b6. Of course, this bishop needs to come into the game. It's blocked by this pawn at the moment, so why not on the long diagonal? But Bluebaum counters this by exchanging on d5. And after pawn takes, he fixes that pawn in the middle by playing d4. Now, there are pros and cons to this move. Of course, it blocks that bishop on b2. And the bishop can come out in this direction, but with that slight weakness on b6, that's not so great when the bishop comes out here, because with the pawn on b6, there are slight weaknesses on the c file now. If you put a pawn on c6, which is generally where you want to, you can see that without the support of the pawn on b7, it's not quite as secure as one would wish. Sanal plays in the normal way, bishop b7, because that bishop is going to potentially support a knight coming into the outpost. Bishop d3, so that bishop sits on the best diagonal. You want that bishop as actively placed as possible, looking down to h7. Knight d7, very standard development, and castles. And Sanal decides to play a6 to stop the knight coming here, because black really wants to place that bishop on this diagonal. That's the most active. But at the moment, if the bishop were to come to d6, then it can always be hit by the knight. So that's the reason that a6 is played, in order to prepare the bishop coming to the most active square. It's not the only way to play. You could throw the knight into e4 straight away, for example. That's certainly not bad. In any case, a6. And Bluebaum has had this position before, and he has played knight e5 here, which is a pretty normal idea. You play the knight to the outpost, and then you might support it with f4. So this triad of pawns, that's known in the Queen's Pawn openings as the Pillsbury attack, named after the great American player Harry Nelson Pillsbury, who was around at the end of the 19th century. So he developed this system, and it was a fearsome idea in those days. So by advancing that f-pawn, yes, you support the knight, but also you make room potentially for the rook to swing across. The queen might swing across as well, and sometimes you can even advance that f-pawn. If a pawn comes to g6, then you can break open the f-file. So that is a very, very common idea in these systems. But Bluebaum didn't do that. Now I think there is a drawback to playing like this. Of course, it allows your opponent to plant that knight on e4, and then potentially you can drive away the knight from e5. I mean, it's complicated, but I think that's the reason why he avoided that. Instead, he played it a different way. Knight e2. So this knight swings round to the king side, and of course it would love to plant itself on that lovely square f5, which is why black plays pawn to g6, not only cuts out the bishop, but prevents that knight moving forward as well. Now this is clear, so that knight can be supported on e5. So the tension is building now, because with the pawn on g6, now I mentioned this previously, that if, for example, queen e7, hitting that knight, then f4, and whoops, f4, and with this pawn on g6, sometimes, I mean later on, you've got to watch out for this knight, of course, that needs support, but sometimes you can play f5, and with the pawn on g6, that can help white to break open the king side. So Sanal played knight e4. So plonking the knight on the outpost. And, well, Bluebaum did something a little bit unexpected here. I mean, one could, for example, just bring the queen out, maybe queen c2, queen e2, but Bluebaum exchanged off his light squared bishop. Normally you wouldn't want to give away that lovely light squared bishop, but he has a very interesting idea in mind. Queen c2, attacking this pawn, and that presents black with something of a dilemma. If the pawn is protected by f5, then you can see that it opens those diagonals. Now there's nothing immediately clear. The check can be answered by king g7. It looks rather scary, but there's actually nothing clear for white there. But I can well understand why black didn't want to play the pawn to f5. I mean, the other thing about f5 is that perhaps white can just try to break things open with f3, but it's not so clear actually. But Sanal played, let's say, the responsible knight f6, keeping that pawn on f7. And now, really interesting move from Matthias Bluebaum. Pawn to d5. Right, over to you. I'll have a drink. You have a think. Black to play. How would you capture that pawn? With the bishop or with the knight? Or would you do something else entirely? Over to you. Black to play. The best move is knight takes d5. It does allow knight takes e4, which sort of brings the knight to a really threatening position, looking at that bishop, also looking at that f6 square. And this is rather a tricky position for black. Also, considering that, you know, one of these rooks can come to the d file and put some pressure here with the queen there. It's a tricky position. In fact, black is okay. Looks funny to give up that dark square bishop, considering that these squares are very weak. But actually, after this, black can exchange some pieces, and black is probably okay. I mean, one could perhaps try this move, but I suspect that black is just about okay there. But it is tricky. Oh yes, you've got to watch out for stuff like this. How's this? Ooh, a check. That looks tasty. But can white get away with something here? Rook here. Queen g5, yeah, should be okay. But it looks tricky. But black is all right there. But Sanal played bishop takes d5, which on the surface of it seems to hold things together. But watch what happens. After this subtle move, queen c3, black is totally lost in this position. There is no way back. Okay, why? Well, basically, the threats on the long diagonal are just too much. So, for example, well, I mean, white threatens to just play knight g4, disturb the knight, and then you're in on the long diagonal. And if this is taken, okay, threat, queen takes knight. King here, well, this one is pretty easy to dislodge. Knight h5, a check, and bishop takes knight. There we go, winning the queen. And there's no way out. So, for example, knight e8, maybe hoping to block with f6. Well, watch this. Rook d1 hits that bishop, and now a killer move, knight c6, gaining time against the queen and threatening a mate down there. And if queen f6, this is very nice. If you take that immediately, actually, black is all right. But first of all, you whip off that bishop. If queen takes, then there's a mate in the corner, and queen takes. For example, knight e7 mate. It all fits together for white. Black is lost here. Sanal tried h5, but knight d7 ended the game. Very simple. We're just trying to get rid of that knight. So, for example, I mean here, black resigned. If, well, obviously knight takes, then queen g7 is mate, and queen takes f6, and mate follows shortly. The only thing that black can do is play bishop e7, but you just win a piece, and that's obviously utterly hopeless for black. Wow, what a swift game. And from this opening, which feels very mild for white, but I do like this maneuver, provoking g6, and then suddenly things become interesting if the long diagonal opens, which Bluebaum succeeded in doing with this pawn sacrifice d5. Although even then, black seems to be okay if he defends correctly. But anyway, very interesting system. Well, what's happening at the top in the Grand Swiss? Well, we've got one player out in lead, Yestepenko, with 3.5 out of 4, and then there's a stack of players on 3 points. So I'll try to keep you updated over the next few days. But this is a cracker of a tournament. By the way, it's 11 rounds, so it's still very, very early days. Thanks for watching.